So my name is Mike Verhoeven. As you mentioned, I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Management Consultant for the Minnesota DNR. And essentially what that means is I provide sort of internal information, subject matter expertise on aquatic invasive species management efforts across the state. Um, and work to sort of provide leadership or unity among our regional specialists who most lake associations have worked with extensively. So in Lake Minnetonka, the regional specialist would be April Londo, um, here in the sort of southeast, the south half of the southeast district of the state.
Right.
Um, some of who I am. So I actually grew up on Cedar Lake in Scott County. So I'm a Minnesota thoroughbred. Did an undergraduate degree, a master's degree, and then a PhD actually at the University of Minnesota. All very diverse educational background, you could say. Not, um, but the things that I have done uh, in that time in academia have largely revolved around aquatic plant ecology, and specifically what impact do invasive species have on native plant communities? So curly-leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil have been the focus of my work. I've done some work as well on starry stonewort, and through the years worked on zebra mussels as well. But have really focused on those two plants that I highlight, curly-leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil. And then, um, in addition to what impact they have on native plant communities, um, I've spent a lot of time thinking and working on what can we accomplish with management of those plants, um, and how does that play into, let's say, general restoration of lake ecology. So that's my background. I am coming to the DNR. I've been here for a whopping 30 days or so, um, after about 10 years at the University of Minnesota, doing those sort of student roles and then working as a research scientist there for 2 years. So that's kind of my background. I've also done some work, lake consulting work where I did survey work and study design stuff, but have variously been involved in aquatic invasive species assessment and management for, over a decade now. Sure. So both curly leaf and Eurasian water milfoil are non-native invasive plants. Curly leaf has been in North America for well over a century, in Minnesota now for over a century as well. I think 1910 was maybe the first documented case in Minnesota. And in contrast, Eurasian water milfoil has been here for about 40 years or so. Um, Here is in Minnesota, um, and was first found in the Chesapeake Bay, I think in the 1930s, maybe, or something like that. Um, but both of those plants are sort of have documented impacts to native plant communities. And what I mean by that is essentially as the abundance of those two invasive plants increases, you see decreases in native plant abundance, native plant diversity, etc. Um, an interesting thing that both of those plants share is where they both seem to be tolerant of declining water quality or clarity, in a way that native plants are not. And so when we think about what we see in our lakes, um, what we often see is that you have this increase in the dominance of these two invasive plants and a subsequent sort of decline in water quality or clarity. And the sort of a big chunk of my research actually looked at both curlyleaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil and asked if those plants were driving those native species declines that were associated with those sort of invasions or dominance, or if they were essentially riding along as water clarity declined. And what I
Mm.
mean by that is, um, you could think of you could think of these things as either drivers or passengers of lake changes. And essentially what we found was that the evidence suggests that curly leaf pondweed is more of a passenger of native species declines. And so the the removal of curly leaf pondweed from a native plant community, let's say from a bay, will generally not result in this sort of resounding rebound of native plants. And based on the work that's been done on curly leaf pondweed, that's probably related to the fact that curly leaf pondweed is essentially not a direct competitor. It is not the one that is shading out those native plants. Its impact on native plants um, is potentially manifesting through things like exacerbating water clarity declines. So a lot of us are familiar with curly leaf's unique life cycle. It's a winter ephemeral. It grows in the fall through the winter and then senesces in the spring or early summer, releasing the nutrients that it captured in its biomass into the lake at sort of a poorly timed um, or releasing its nutrients in a poor timing and promoting sort of algal growth or decreases in water clarity. On the other hand, Eurasian water milfoil does seem to be a direct competitor, which means it's actually competing for the same space, light, resources as native plants. And so, broadly, the impacts of those plants, Eurasian water milfoil, curly leaf pondweed, can look similar, but the mechanisms by which they cause those impacts can be a little different. Um, but zooming out to the highest level, both of those plants are well documented as having negative impacts to lake ecology in various ways.
Okay. And when you say senescence, you mean it dies off, right? Just to
Yep.
put it in non researcher speak.
Yes, please keep me honest on that. I will try to answer the next question in a shorter way. And yes, what I meant when I said senescence is that it dies. So
It
essentially,
dies.
it's a winter ephemeral, which, unlike almost any other native plant that we have, it sprouts in the fall, grows a bit in the fall. It has just enough photosynthesis through the winter to maintain its own life. So if you drill holes through the ice, sometimes you'll see curly leaf plants are about 8 inches tall, essentially waiting for the ice to go out and the water to warm, the sun to come out, and then they grow in the spring. They senesce, or it's an annual plant, so they die um, in approximately June. And in that same time point, they reproduce and create something called turions, which many of us are familiar. They're almost like a leaf potato. It's a starchy structure that is asexual, a reproductive structure. So they make that. And then, unlike our native plants, curly leaf pondweed actually over summers through its seeds, which are those turions, which aren't a true seed, but that's a sidebar for scientists. Doesn't really matter. Um, the gist being that curly leaf pondweed is able to cope with poor water clarity in many systems because it doesn't actually do photosynthesis during the summer. It's just laying dormant in those turions.
Yeah. And when it dies off is when it releases all of the nutrients into the water, correct?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's more nuanced than that. But it so like any plant, when it dies off, it doesn't just immediately degrade and release everything. Depending on, we haven't studied this specifically in Minnesota, and it's in fact not even been perfectly documented for curly leaf pondweed. But for macrophytes, you see something like, uh, let's say, let's say 15 to 30% of those nutrients are released really quickly when it senesces. And for curly leaf, because of its weird life cycle, it might even be more than that. But then so you have this big release of nutrients and then a long, slow decay that is
Yeah.
essentially mediated by like degradation by microbial um, breakdown of the plants. I'll answer it two ways. One is in the very strict sense of your question, there's a huge amount of variation in how we manage aquatic plants across the state. However, for curly leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil, predominantly it's done via either herbicide management, so using pesticides in the lake, sort of in a targeted way to manage those stands, if you will, which are like the areas of growth of those plants, um, or via mechanical control, which is sometimes hand removal, sometimes these big floating hay binds of sorts that cut the plants off. You can dig into the nitty gritty of what
Yeah.
kinds of pesticides or what you accomplish with all those things. But generally speaking, those are the two ways. The second
Okay.
thing I'll say is there are actually some nice evaluations of large scale evaluations. So from Minnesota, I actually did one of them for curly leaf pondweed. We looked at 50 lakes between something like 2006 and 2015, maybe. Um, and that's a free paper. If you search my name on Google and curly leaf pondweed, I think you'll probably find that paper. But the gist of it was that management is effective. It drives down the abundance of curly leaf pondweed. It's critical to have multi-year management for curly leaf pondweed. And what I mean by that is what's happening when you manage it is you're trying to prevent reproduction so that you can slowly decrease the abundance of seeds in the seed bank. In the case of
Yeah.
curly leaf pondweed, it's actually turions in the turion bank because they're not true seeds. Um, but the gist is
And
the
how many
same.
years, yeah, how many years are you recommending for that? I mean, I've heard 7 years. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
Yeah, I would say that the data suggests. So one thing I'll say is that there's huge variation. A crummy thing about natural systems is that there's huge variation. So I will
Sure,
tell you what the data show for like the average for these 50 lakes.
sure.
Um, but know that in any one given lake, it could absolutely be that they're the exception to the rule, and it only takes 3 years, or in their third year, the population booms. So yeah, I would say um, something somewhere between like 4 and 7 years is where you
Okay.
got to, let's say, an 80% or a 70% reduction in from the original coverage in the lake. And what I mean by that is the
Yeah.
frequency of occurrence, which is the number of sample points where that plant was present. It would totally depend on how it's done. So, generally
Okay.
speaking, mechanical control is um, limited by the spatial scale at which it can be done. So, let's like focus on curly leaf pondweed for a second since we're there.
Yeah.
The point or sort of the crux of managing curly leaf pondweed is preventing reproduction. And in order to do that, you need to either reduce its biomass or sorry, e- either harvest the plants so that they can't set seed, right? Not seeds, turions, whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, or use a pesticide to kill the plants before they produce that seed. Because once they produce seed, the pesticides are no longer effective. They do not kill the turions.
Sure.
Um, with mechanical harvesting, you could also harvest the plants when they have produced turions. If you are harvesting up into this haybine and taking them to a trash heap, you've prevented reproduction. So, generally speaking, these methods could all be effective. Mechanical
Okay.
management is generally limited by on its upper limit in terms of acreage by the cost and the ability to execute this. Most of these haybines, these underwater harvesters, are no more than 12 feet wide at the upper limit.
Right.
And so in order to effectively manage, let's say a 40 or 50 acre plot, they're, slowly moving this 12-foot wide harvester through those areas. That being said, if it can be used in such a way that it successfully prevents reproduction of a population of curly leaf pondweed, it could absolutely be effective. I think scales and there it is not my expertise, but I think cost often drives what method is used because
Right.
these mechanical or physical removal methods often involve large costs as you get up to larger spatial scales.
Right. Right. So, my next question is, does the DNR recommend any type of removal? I mean, does the DNR say, hey, we recommend this versus this when you look at, the pesticides versus the mechanical? Is there a recommendation that like April would give us?
That's a good question. Not to my knowledge. So I'm thinking about invasive aquatic plant management. So this is
Yep.
into the nitty gritty, but in statute and rule, there are two kinds of plant management: aquatic plant management, which is largely for recreational access, and invasive aquatic plant management, which has a designated purpose of reducing the abundance of the invasive plant while being selective for the invasive plant. So our goal in invasive aquatic plant management is to leave the native plant community alone and help sort of promote a healthy plant community, um, while reducing the invader. And generally speaking, no, there's not a recommendation. I think if you're looking for best management practices and recommendations, probably the best place to look is the research that's been done. Like I mentioned, that paper highlighting the importance of multi-year management.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, um, our role as specialists across the state is going to be to provide sort of the technical advising to say,
Yeah.
yeah, this area that you're managing has these constraints of depth of mixed native plant communities, or the opposite of those things, shallow and um, single species stands of the invader. And so these are the things that we would sort of advise in those situations. But not sure that directly answers your question. I think the direct answer is it's very context dependent, and
Sure.
we at the DNR rely on our specialists across the state, um, and sort of I interface directly with those specialists to try to choose methods that suit the problem or the context of the situation. Most permits are completely handled by the single regional specialist that handles that area. So for
Okay.
your permit at Harrison's Bay, it probably goes to a work dashboard on April. So you all are probably familiar with this thing called MPARS, the Minnesota DNR's
Yeah.
permitting and reporting system. That essentially sends a report to April. It says Harrison's Bay has requested a um, permit to do curly leaf pondweed management. Um, and that specialist is going to look at the information you've submitted, such as delineation maps of what the
Yeah.
population of curly leaf looks like in the area. Many of our specialists, I mean, April, the central region, which is roughly from St. Cloud on down to um, the corner of Minnesota and Iowa at the sort of southeast edge of the state. That region has a lot of work, so it's less common in that region, but many of the specialists will have biological surveys that they've conducted of the lakes to look at the populations. And so they'll essentially they do a permit review. So they
Yeah.
bring in your application. What have you asked for? Um, and at the highest level, they're asking, is the management action that you've suggested selective for the invasive species you're suggesting managing, and will it result in a reduction in a significant reduction in the invasive plant? And if it meets those criteria, generally speaking, that is a permit that our program would approve. I mentioned that technical guidance that we provide. Most often in that conversation, you might get a call from a specialist if they think you've chosen or suggested a method that it doesn't make sense for the invasive. Like all of our specialists are trained biologists and are familiar with these invasive species populations, management of them. And so if you've chosen a method, let's say you suggested harvesting curly leaf pondweed in March, right after it sprouts, right after the ice out, and they think, hey, that's probably a bad idea because that mechanical harvest is just going to cut the top off the plants and they're going to continue growing.
Right.
They would reach out to you in a technical advising way and say, hey, this is probably not the best method for this. Here's why, and here are some suggestions of things that you could do otherwise.
Right. Right. We use, and I know that this is a requirement from a permit standpoint, is that you use a licensed applicator. And one of the things that was mentioned to us, so right now we are using James Johnson to do freshwater to do our surveys. So he does all the surveys and our delineation maps. And then we are using PLM, lake management, to do our treatment. And so one of the claims is that we're getting our consulting from people that are receiving money from us. And that's a conflict of interest, that we're not getting the right consulting. And I want to somehow be able to address that. Um, Obviously, we're not biologists, right? We're not biologists. We're an association, and we feel like we've hired these highly trained people who are looking at our bay and giving us recommendations as part of that. Can you talk to that a little bit? Are you able to talk to that?
Sure, sure. I want to give the disclaimer here of I know both of those people you're talking about. I mean, it's a small group working
Yeah.
on lake management in the state, but I know both of the people you're talking about. And James Johnson actually hired me to do survey work in the past as a subcontractor.
Okay.
Um, uh, so you mentioned license. Yeah, I mean, I think probably what you're posing is an a somewhat unresolvable claim without doing some check or work. And what I mean by that is uh, anyone could also say that I am full of it. Uh, I will tell
Right.
you that my primary care is lake conservation, and um, I am, a trained scientist that will do what I can to do work that is true to what is observed in the system. I know James Johnson does lots of Freshwater Scientific Services is James Johnson's company, and we see lots of survey work from Freshwater Scientific. And I don't know of any problematic surveys from that consulting company, but we have seen from other consulting companies occasionally um, poorly done surveys. We have inspection authority on our permits, and what that means is when you submit a permit, we have the authority to go and inspect that delineation. And so to bring people up to speed, they don't. Delineation is a delineation of where the plants are growing in the bay, let's say. And when it comes to the DNR, we can go inspect that delineation and say, yes, indeed, we went and looked at James's work or Freshwater Scientific's work, and we see that the plants, as described in the survey, the conditions in the bay reflect that survey. Um, we think that it's a great practice, however, not required unless you're talking about using Minnesota DNR grant money. Generally speaking, it's not required that you have different aquatic plant survey consultants and application consultants. Um, but all of the questions or concerns you highlight there are not new things that we've heard, and we're open to hearing suggestions as to how we, as a community of um, lake lovers and conservationists, can try to do better. But at this time, hiring professional scientists to or biologists to do those assessments um, seems like a great way to do it. And to my knowledge, the when you split a lake consultant like James Johnson, who's doing these surveys, Freshwater Scientific doing these surveys, from the the applicator, as you described it, PLM, I don't know that there's any financial connection between them, but I'm not really sure how your contracts are set up. Um, but
Yeah,
I
we
think
we pay each consultant separately. So it's not like
yeah, I think
we're
that's a great.
yeah, yeah. And that was the reason. And I think that at the time that we selected James to do this, we consulted at the time it was with Keenan,
Keegan Lund, yes,
Keegan, Keegan. Yes.
previous to April
So
Londo. Yep.
we consulted with Keegan at the DNR, who would be, yeah, the April of the time. And we really looked at the best way to do this. So we didn't make assumptions on who we were going to use. We consulted the DNR for that part of it. And I just, I wanted to kind of separate that and maybe have someone else comment on, is that, would you say, a best practice to do that kind of thing?
Yeah, it is, and I think as I call it as evidence to that point that it's a best practice when the Minnesota DNR's AIS program gives money via our grants
Yeah.
to do AIS work, we require that mapping or delineation of the invasive species is done by someone or a company that is not the same as the person being paid to do management, whether it's application of a pesticide or diver assisted suction harvesting. We want to see that a separate biologist has gone out and defined where the problem is,
Yeah,
and the person who's being paid to manage the problem is that we've disconnected that sort of financial incentive to find more than
right.
what is there. And I'll say that there's a list on the Minnesota DNR website. I could follow up with this link. There's a
Yep.
list of consultants in the state that have that sort of do that type of work, delineations or point intercept surveys. Um, and many of them attend a joint class between the University of Minnesota Extension and the Minnesota DNR and get certified in their taxonomic ID. So, like, do they know what species of plant they're finding when they're finding it? And that qualification or checkout is on that list that I'm mentioning. So,
Okay. Okay. I will, I'm sure it's readily available, so I can find that and post the link
sure.
as part of this. Another question would be,
Yeah, this is a great question. So, much of what we do in practical management is supported by the scientific literature that has assessed the questions you're asking. So, the answer that I'm about to give is based on not Harrison's Bay information,
right,
um, but generally comparable work that's been done. So, we consider ourselves science-based practitioners. So much like a we look for examples in the scientific literature that have done similar work to answer the questions that you're asking. So,
yep,
targeted control of, I don't know, it's 42 acres of curlyleaf pondweed in Harrison's Bay. So, there's been, so curlyleaf pondweed is unique. Remember, I mentioned this is a winter ephemeral plant. It's
yep,
unique in that you can achieve selectivity for curlyleaf pondweed while leaving native plants unharmed by doing early season pesticide use. So, in addition to preventing the reproduction of curlyleaf pondweed by managing it in, let's say, early May, you can also avoid using that pesticide in the lake. And for curlyleaf pondweed, for the most part, there's a handful of chemicals that are used, but for the most part, the pesticides that are used, the herbicides that are used are contact herbicides, which means they're going to kill most plants that they come into contact with. Um, an interesting thing about curlyleaf pondweed is its winter growth. So if you kill curlyleaf pondweed this time of year, you've killed it at a time when it's essentially exhausted all of its resources growing up to sort of its annual peak biomass. And if you kill it, it won't have enough energy left, in most cases, enough energy left in its root structure or in those old turions that germinated last October to regrow a second growth, if you will. And in contrast, most of our native plants have just started growing in the last 3 to 4 weeks. And so if you get, like, let's say you had a mixed stand of native plants and curlyleaf pondweed, and you can't spatially target curlyleaf pondweed, if you do get kill on those native plants, the literature suggests that the native plant community recovers quickly. Essentially, they don't. The native macrophytes don't suffer over the 1 year and further time scale, um, owing to the fact that if you, let's say you have um, a northern water milfoil plant, a native water milfoil plant that just started growing 4 weeks ago. It's 18 inches tall. You use a contact herbicide and you kill that 18 inches of vegetation. And contact herbicides, I should say, basically kill the parts of the plant that they touch. So they kill the vegetative parts, much like a chemical mowing of sorts. There's enough energy still in the root crown of that plant that it starts regrowing in 3 days when most of the herbicide has been, well, when there's not enough herbicide in the lake now to have any impact on it, starts growing again, and it can recover even within the year, but certainly across years. And so that's the gist of targeting the invasive plant in the context of curlyleaf pondweed um, relative to native plant communities.
and early in the season. So we treated our curly leaf like the 1st of May, like May 1st. So,
Yeah, awesome. And I say early in the season, what guides these decisions is, again, scientific literature studies that have essentially shown that approximately between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit is when you get this useful window where curly leaf pondweed is rapidly taking up the herbicide, so it sort of gets readily destructed. Native plants aren't actively growing, so there's this chemical targeting that can happen. The native plants actually chemically don't take up as much of the herbicide. And then in addition, curly leaf is in that energetic state to be wiped out, whereas native plants are in an energetic state where they can rebound, even if they do get burned.
Okay.
Um,
That-
and in
That's,
that,
I mean, that's fascinating. Yeah,
yeah, and in
thank
that
you.
same window is turion reproduction happens. And so, um, yeah, roughly something like um, 14 hours of daylight, 12 to 14 hours of daylight, and the 60-degree mark for water temperature is when the plants sort of produce those seeds, the turions that are not seeds, but um, that's
Okay.
the
So
gist
we're
of it.
trying to get in before that.
Yep, you want to prevent reproduction. So the DNR actually does not, well, I mean, we sort of decide we have to use what is approved by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and the Minnesota Department of Agriculture has to use what is approved by the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal agency. So the Minnesota DNR doesn't really have any um, expertise or governance on the safety of these pesticides and which are approved. We are essentially allowed to use what the Environmental Protection Agency approves at the federal level, and then what the Minnesota Department of Agriculture allows into the state. And the Minnesota Department of Agriculture comes into play here because they have vast expertise in pesticides, herbicides.
Okay. Are you familiar with some of the debate about dicot at all, that it's banned by the European Union? Are you familiar with that?
Loosely or roughly, yeah. It is still
Yeah.
approved by the EPA.
Yep.
So in the United States, our regulatory agency for these for FIFRA, which is the act that governs these pesticides, is the EPA. So it's approved by the EPA and still approved in Minnesota
Okay. That's
by the
what you.
MDA. No, I will make one more comment on diquat, and it is that that is a pesticide that, like many of our pesticides, through time, we have learned about them. And that is a pesticide that sometime in the 90s, there was a study that showed that. So this is like kind of in the nitty gritty, but for herbicides, the the guiding document is the label of the herbicide. So the EPA essentially ensures that or requires that the guidance that is needed to use that in the manner that is deemed safe by the EPA has to be on the label. And in the 90s, there was a study, a really nice study that showed that the label did not have an adequate safety window for, I believe, specifically larval walleye. Um, and what happened through time is that label changed. And so in my 30 days here at the DNR, I have heard an immense amount about worry about the risk of diquat to walleye. Um, and I would encourage anyone who has those questions um, to sort of, I guess, rest assured. But if you care to dig into it, dig into the fact that through time, that was essentially headed off by this emergent science that showed that this chemical was potentially problematic in its use, and the label changed. And so now, diquat, as it is labeled, there is no scientific sort of evidence to support these same whatever impacts to larval walleye. So the
You're based
the
on the
chemical
approved con-.
changed through time. The use of the chemical changed to give a margin of safety for that
So are you
toxicity.
talking about the approved concentrations of it for different uses, or when you say the label has changed, what are you referring to?
Yes, the approved concentration. Yep. So the gist of it
Oh,
was a previous label said you can use it at concentration X, and I believe it was based on surface acreage. And through time, now you can use it at, they have actual water concentrations. And so they essentially brought that down, the amount of herbicide you could use per volume
yep,
of water,
yep,
and it does now have a margin of safety. And there's a really nice open literature EPA review to that end, and that scientific study had subsequent follow-up articles that said, yes, indeed, the label now, um, whatever, includes a margin of safety for those fish. The the core of your question is, do we have evidence anywhere really to support the idea that managing these invasive species is negatively impacting fisheries? Um, and the short answer is no, not to date. Um, that is not to say that we should not study or evaluate that. And it is not to say that there may truly be some impact, but no, to date, there's not been evidence to my knowledge. There could be information out there that I don't know about, and I'd love to see it if anybody finds it. But to my knowledge, there's not evidence to support the idea that specifically managing curly leaf pondweed is having negative impacts on fisheries.
okay. And
There's,
milfoil?
I'm just thinking there's a thesis
Okay.
actually that came. This person works for the Minnesota DNR now. There's a thesis that came out of Wisconsin, like a graduate student thesis. Nicholas Rydell is his name. He's a researcher now for the Minnesota DNR. And I will look at his thesis, but I don't know that it doesn't really matter. But I'll take a look at the EWM piece, but I believe he actually assessed fisheries um, outcomes of Eurasian water milfoil management with 2,4-D or some formulation of 2,4-D. And I can look at that. But generally speaking, that would be kind of a big, that would not kind of, that would be a really big deal. If we learned that managing invasive species was having a negative impact on fisheries, that would be a really big deal. And I would hope that I would key into that work and know about it. And to my knowledge, there's not anything that suggests that. There is some work to the contrary that suggests in Wisconsin, there's some studies showing that monoculture, which would be like big, big, homogeneous, consistent, only Eurasian water milfoil stands, can actually reduce fish growth rates. So there's this kind of cool experimental study where they used a harvester to make more structural complexity in these monocultural stands of Eurasian water milfoil, and saw that fish growth responded positively to that. But generally speaking, Patrick, no, there's not anything that we know about right now that suggests invasive plant management is having negative impacts on fisheries.
Okay. And to what extent do the fisheries at the DNR get involved in what's happening in a specific lake or bay or
That's a great question. So if your lake or bay has a lake vegetation management plan, so
which we
that's
do, which we do.
usually the fisheries team for your region um, gets involved in the development of that management plan. So they look at what you're proposing to do.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for this.